Hey guys, welcome back. Kenny here. A lot of you guys have requested that I teach the basic fundamentals of Blender, and I do know a lot about Blender. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert, but I will definitely teach you everything that I do know from scratch. So let's say you've never opened up the program before, you've just opened it up, and you just want to learn how to navigate everything, the basics of how things work, keyframing, shading, lighting. I'm going to go through what I think are the most important fundamentals of Blender. If you guys have any questions, you can drop them down below, but go ahead, open up Blender. Let's go ahead and create our first document, and I'm going to walk you through exactly what you need to do to learn. Let's go ahead and hop right into it. Alright guys, so when you first open up Blender, you're going to see a screen that looks like this. You're going to have a few different options here. I have a bunch of saved files from before, but since you're just starting out, you're not going to click anything. You're actually just going to click away from this, and this is what you're going to be given right here. So to start out, Blender gives you a light source, a cube, and your camera. So I'm going to kind of go over how to navigate everything, how to move stuff around, and kind of just how everything works. So first of all, if you click the middle mouse wheel and you move around, you can see that you can rotate around your scene. So guys, just try that out, just to rotate around and kind of look around just like that. Pretty easy. Scrolling in and out will zoom you in and out of the scene. Pretty simple stuff there. Now, if you hold shift and then you click the middle mouse wheel, you'll actually pan around, which is really nice. So let's say that you just want to, instead of going like this, you just want to move. You would hold shift and middle click the mouse wheel to move around like that. And of course, you guys, this is just how to move around your scene. To select an object, you just click it. Now that cube is selected. Now let's say that you want to move this object or rotate it. Over here on the left, we have a bunch of options. We have our move option, so you can move your cube along any axis, just like so. Now, if you hold Control, you will actually snap your cube in different increments like that. So that's something good to know. You can move it up and down, left and right. Now, if you click towards the center while you're on move, you can freely move it on all axes. But I personally like to use the arrows so that I can move it along any axis that I want. And you'll see right here on the top right, your axes are showed right here. So you have the Z axis, which is up and down, the Y, which is right and left, and then the X, which is forward and backwards. And if you go ahead and click this and rotate it, you can also rotate around your scene very easily. And if you were to click one of these, if I click X, it will actually snap you to the X view. And then if you click -Y, it'll snap you to your -Y view. And this is really useful for easily snapping to a certain view so you can get a different perspective on your scene. So definitely very useful to know. Now, if we wanted to rotate our object, we could click on our rotate tool. And then we can freely rotate it, or just like before, we can choose an axis to rotate on. And if you hold Control while doing this, you can actually snap to a certain degree. Now you're probably wondering, where do I actually find the actual values of where it is and how it's rotated? Right here near your axes, there's a little arrow. You want to pop that out, and then you want to make sure you have item selected. Now you see if I click a different item, it'll show me the locational and rotational values of that item up here. But if you click on our cube, you can see right now it's actually not in the dead center because we've moved it. So I'm just going to recenter it, set it to 0. Now it's in the perfect center. So guys, this is how you can also manually input locations. You can use a slider to slide this, okay? And of course, if you just want to rotate the Z 45 degrees, you would just type in 45, and now our cube is rotated on a 45-degree angle. So that's pretty simple. Now let's go ahead and reset that, and I'm going to show you how to scale. Scaling is also just as easy as clicking your scale tool over here. If you want to scale it along the x-axis, you can do so by clicking and dragging. You can do the same for the y, and the same for the same for the y and same for the z. Now let's say you just want to scale it all together. You click from the middle, just like that. Now guys, this is great and all, having these tools over here, but there are also shortcuts to know. Let's say I just have my cube selected and I want to scale it along the z-axis. S is our shortcut for scale, and then Z will target just the z-axis. So that is a super, super useful thing to know, guys. Definitely keep that in mind for your shortcut. Again, this works for any axis, SY and SX. And you just move your cursor along the view to scale it. Pretty simple. If you just click S, you'll scale the whole object on all axes. Now, rotate is the same, but R is the shortcut. So R will just rotate freely. If you do RY, you can see that we're just rotating on the Y-axis, and it works the same for all axes. Now, to move an object, G is the shortcut. G, I'm moving freely, okay? Again, you can snap it to an axis. GZ will snap to the Z axis, GY, etc. And I'm just Control Zing to reset my position here. So undoing is the same as it is in any other program. I'm also going to show you guys how you can easily duplicate an object. Shift D, right? And then you just want to click and drag our object away. Now let's say we wanted to Shift D and then quickly snap our object back to the same location. Shift D and just press Enter. And now you have two cubes in the same location. And the way you know you have two cubes is you can just look up here in the top right in our hierarchy, and it'll show you that there are two cubes created. Now let's say we want to move this one cube above the other. GZ, using our shortcuts we learned, and now we have one cube above the other. So we can see what we've duplicated here. If you want to delete an object, X is the delete key. So X, delete. You can also do this by right-clicking and deleting at the bottom there. So there's plenty of shortcuts to do almost anything in Blender. Another great shortcut that I learned is if you click on an object and you're really zoomed out, you can press the period key on the numpad and it will actually zoom you into that object that you've selected. That way you can quickly look at the object up close and just snap right to it. And it should work for almost anything. Works for the camera, it works for the sun lamp, anything that you want to quickly view and zoom in on. So guys, that is another great way to do that. You're probably wondering what some of these other tools are over here. Some of these I don't use, I'll be honest with you. Transform is a good one, but what happens when you click transform is it gives you all of your options. Your move options, your rotate options, and your scale options. Personally, I like to edit these individually, but if you want to keep this on so that you can see all of your transform tools at once, that's totally up to you. Annotate is the next one down, and annotate just allows you to draw in your scene so that you can kind of circle something, come back to it. It's really good for tutorials like this because I can say, hey, this is the origin point right here, this is your y-axis, and this is your x-axis, and of course your z. So annotate is kind of just a useful tool for tutorials and other things like that. And of course when you draw something, you have it all up here as a note. You can remove it or you can add a new one. It's totally up to you how you want to use this tool. You're also given a line, polygon, and an eraser so that you can easily draw on your scene without affecting the actual 3D objects themselves. Measure is also a great tool. Again, I rarely use this one because I normally look at these metrics up here. But if you want to measure something real quick, you can click and drag, and you'll notice our cube looks like to be about 1.5 meters across, which I actually thought it was 1 by 1, so I'm not sure why it's saying that. Yeah, so anyway, that's how you measure things. You just click and drag just like that. So that's another tool. And then lastly, I actually just learned about this right before this tutorial. I don't use this at all because when I add meshes, I add them a different way. But if you guys want to go ahead and try this out, you can basically just click and drag to draw any shape, and then you can extrude it to make, say a cube or anything else. And if you hold shift, I believe it snaps to a perfect dimension. So that's one way to add objects, but I'm going to show you a different way. So I'm going to go back to my tweak tool, which is just to select anything. There's other ways to select things as well. I mainly use this one. You guys can use these as well. I just prefer this method. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on my cube here. I'm actually going to delete my cube. I want to show you guys how to add objects. Up top here, you'll see there's an add button. So you want to click add and you'll get this big drop down. Don't be overwhelmed. These are just all the options available to you. You'll understand everything once I go through them. I'm going to show you each object and kind of what it does. Adding a plane, right? You want to click plane, just adds basically what is a piece of paper or a plane. It's very, very simple geometry. There's not really much to it. You can scale it and rotate it just like any other object. But I don't want this in my scene, so I'm going to X to delete it. You can also add in a cube, which is what you're given with the default file. What else do we have here? We have a circle. So circle isn't actually a 3D shape. It's more of just a curve, but I will get into that stuff later. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Let's go ahead and add a sphere. So everybody knows what a sphere is. That is a sphere right there. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. I'm going to show you guys some other objects. There's also an icosphere. And when you add in an object, you'll see that there's this little thing down here, this little drop down. Sorry, let me move my logo so you guys can see that. Apologies. There's this little drop down. You can actually decide some of the metrics about the shape itself. You can see I can up the subdivisions, and you can adjust the radius of the object. It's really cool because when you add in an object, you can pretty much specify anything down here. Not every object gives you that opportunity, but this one does, so it's kind of nice to have. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And now I'm going to go ahead and add in a cylinder. And as you can see, again, down here, we can actually adjust the amount of vertices. We can almost create some sort of crystal formation like that. But the more vertices you have, the smoother your cube is, or your cylinder is going to look. Again, you can adjust the depth, the radius, all down here. Now, of course, you can also do this with your scale function and your scale function and whatnot. But I just wanted to show you guys another way to do it when you manually add the shape in. I'm going to delete that. And lastly, we'll do the cone and the torus. Again, you guys can adjust all these settings down here. I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to go ahead and add in a torus. You can add more segments if you need to make it smoother. And then we have the monkey, Suzanne. So the monkey is really nice to kind of practice on because you can go ahead and add different modifiers to this just to see what a more complex geometry would look like. And of course, you can also scale it up and down with this tool down here. So guys, that's how you add objects into your scene. So I'm going to add a couple of objects and just kind of, we're going to play around with them, and I'm going to show you kind of some of the things that you can do. Let's go ahead and move this, GZ. So we have a sphere and we have a cube. Now, what I want to do next is I want to kind of go over the hierarchy and kind of what everything means up here and how it all works, because you guys need to understand this as well. One thing to keep in mind, make sure you're saving while you're doing this. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this to my desktop just as walkthrough. Make sure you're saving frequently. Sometimes Blender will crash if you have a lot of complex geometry or a lot of stuff going on. So guys, this is called your hierarchy up here. This is where you have your collections and all of your objects. As you can see, if I zoom out, we should only have 4 things in there. Our camera, as you can see, it's highlighted up here when it's selected. Our light, our sphere, and our cube. And that's all you see in our main collection up here. And you can collapse and expand these collections. Let's say I wanted to create a collection of our objects, right? I want these 2 objects to be in their own collection so I can keep the file organized. I would click on both of these, or I would click and drag to select both of these. Sorry, I'm on the wrong tool here. I want to be on my select box. There we go. If I click and drag, I can select these 2. And I'm going to use the shortcut M, which is going to make a new collection. I'm going to press enter, and I'm going to name this shape collection. I'm going to press enter. And now, as you can see on the right, I've created basically what is a folder or a collection of these 2 objects. And if I want to hide them, I can hide the whole collection. Now, when I use this little eye tool right here, you see it looks like an eye. If I click that icon and hide them, they're hidden in our viewport right here. But when I go to render my image or my animation, they're still going to show. And the way that we know that is because we have this camera icon here. This camera icon means that the object will show up in render. So if I click this camera icon, even though we can still see these in our viewport, we will not see them when we render, because our camera icon is deselected. So that is something super important to keep in mind, especially when you have a scene with a lot of objects, because when you start adding a lot of objects, things can get really, really complicated really fast. Another thing I want to point out, when you duplicate an object within a collection, it will stay within that collection. So definitely something to keep in mind as well. For example, if I have my light here and I duplicate it, it's only going to duplicate within our collection up here. So guys, this is kind of how you keep things organized. It's a great way to keep things collapsed, organized. You can hide and show things. Let's say I don't want my camera and my lights to show. I just want to focus on my objects. I just will hide the camera and the light. Again, if you want to rename something, you can go up here and just say camera and lights. And all I did there was I just double clicked on the actual collection to rename it. You can also rename objects in your hierarchy. Let's say I wanted, instead of cube, I just wanted to call this best friend, because we all love the default cube. So that would be how you would rename something. And you can do the same with the spheres. You can hide specific objects. So guys, I just want to show you kind of how to work the hierarchy. I'm going to go ahead and delete a few of these extra things in here because we don't need them at the moment. So now I'm going to get into some more of the basics within the viewport. As you can see, we're only in our layout tab here, so I'm just going over the basics of the layout tab. There's really not a lot going on here at the moment, but I just wanted to go over some more of the basics. There's really just so much to cover, but I'm going to go over a few more things. So I'm going to show you guys how to snap to the camera. There's so many ways to do this. The first way is to go to View, Cameras, Active Camera. And as you can see, we're now in our camera view. To get out of camera view, I'm just going to rotate back around the scene. So now I'm not in the camera view anymore. Another way to snap to the camera view is 0 on the numpad. That is the quickest way probably because it's a shortcut. So 0 snaps you to the camera view, okay? Again, you can adjust any parameter about the camera, and I'll show you more about the camera later. And I think those are the two main ways to do that, but I personally like 0 because it's the fastest. So I wanted to show you guys that. Next, let's go ahead and show you guys about the different render engines that there are. Before I do that though, because we're currently in Eevee, there's Eevee, Workbench, and Cycles. We're not going to even go anywhere near Workbench because it's pretty much useless. Eevee and Cycles are the main thing we're going to be focused on. Up here, you guys are going to notice a bunch of little gizmos, so don't get overwhelmed. Everything is all good. I'm going to go through each one and show you what they do. Starting here, X-ray. So I'm going to toggle X-ray on. Basically, all that does is exactly what you probably think it would do. It allows you to see through objects, and this is super important if, let's say, you have an object within another object, but you may not realize it's there. I'm going to turn X-ray mode off. You have no idea that there's a cube within this one. You might see it in the hierarchy, but you're just not sure. If you click on X-ray, now you can see our cube within the other cube. So that is a super useful thing to know when you're dealing with complex projects with a lot of objects, guys. So I just wanted to show you that real quick. I'm going to go ahead and actually delete that inner cube, and I'm going to toggle X-ray back off. Right now we're in solid view, and that is this little sphere right here. This, to the left of it, is wireframe view. And what that allows you to see is the wireframe of the objects, all the vertices, the segments, the vertexes, everything that makes up the object. You'll be able to see it in this view. It is similar to X-ray because you can see through the object, but it just allows you to see the actual geometry of the object and what it looks like. This is super helpful if you want to see if your scene has a lot of complexity to it, or you just want to look at the wireframe view. It's a little bit less taxing. So now let's go back to solid view. The next one up is going to be called material preview. We don't really have any materials applied to our objects yet, but this is just a preview of what they will look like before we go into our rendered view. The next view over is our rendered view. So now this is where you'll actually see how our lighting, our materials, and our scene all combine together to create a final look. Now, this isn't the final look because we haven't gone to actually render our image or our animation yet. But this is a good preview that's really close to what it will look like when it's rendered. You'll probably notice that these are very, very rough. And that's because they're very low poly, which means they don't have a lot of vertices and they don't have a lot of segments to them. In order to fix that, we can just right click and shade smooth. And now we have a smooth sphere. But if you zoom in, you'll notice it's still a bit jagged. So I'm going to Control Z that to undo it. And I'm just going to show you a really quick way to add some subdivisions to this to make it smoother. If you go over here to our Modifiers tab, I'm going to click this drop down and I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier. And what that's going to do is it's going to add more divisions to all of our segments and increase the complexity of the sphere. I'm going to jump that up to 2 for the viewport and 3 for the render. And now I'm going to right click, shade smooth. And as you'll notice, we have a very smooth sphere now compared to this other one. So guys, that's just a quick way to smooth out objects. The same would work for this, but you don't need a subdivision surface for the cube. So now that you know about the different views, I'm going to go back to solid view. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go over to our the render properties, and instead of Eevee for our render engine, I'm going to click on cycles. And now what I'm going to do is go back to our rendered view, this right sphere over here. And now you're going to notice how much more realistic this is going to look compared to Eevee, because they both handle light differently. Eevee sort of fakes the light, right? But then Cycles doesn't. It uses real-world calculations to calculate how light would bounce off of things. I prefer Cycles, but everybody will use something different. You'll also notice we have feature set over here, supported and experimental. Experimental is created by the developers of Blender to offer what is an experimental part of the build for you to mess around with. I'm not really going to go too much into that. I think there's documentation online, but I'm just going to click on supported. And if you do have a dedicated GPU, go ahead and click that. You can use your CPU to render things out. That's totally fine. I'm going to be using my GPU because it's much, much faster, as you can see. And it updates a lot quicker, so I can make more creative changes in a shorter amount of time. So guys, those are some of the basics of the viewport. I think I've almost covered just about everything. There is a lot more in here. Some of these are add-ons, so I'm not going to go through these 3 things because they're actually add-ons. A lot of this other stuff has to do with the way your scene looks, where your 3D cursor is, let's see, what's selected and what's not, how your tools are working. This, in my opinion, is the most important panel, your item panel, because it allows you to see where an object is, how it's rotated, etc. Now, if your computer slows down in this view, you can switch back to solid view, because right here, none of the lighting is really being calculated. You're in a very simple view the computer can easily process and understand in order for you to make changes to your scene without it slowing down. I'm going to go ahead and save our project. Now let's go ahead and go over the camera. There is a lot to know about the camera, so I'm just going to click on the camera and I'm going to show you guys some of the attributes of what it can do and how it works. So I'm actually going to snap to my camera view. Okay, now you guys can see that we're in our camera view here, and I'm going to go into rendered view. So now there's this little green icon over here. That's our camera. I'm going to click on that, and now I'm just going to go through all the settings of the camera, and there's quite a few. As you can see, this is the default lens that we're given. It's a 50mm lens with a perspective view. I'm just going to quickly show you the difference between perspective and orthographic. Orthographic gives you a much more, orthographic view that is almost like a grid type of layout. Orthographic cameras I don't believe exist in real life, but perspective do, and perspective is mainly what you'll see in real life used with the real cameras and in real film. So orthographic is a lot of fun to play around with if you want to create very cool satisfying animations or whatnot. I like to use it a lot because I just think it gives a really, really cool perspective on everything. But we're going to go back to our camera and we're going to switch to perspective for now. Now, a cool little trick that I learned from someone recently is you can actually select the type of camera that you're using. If you click this drop down and you click on this, you can actually select from real cameras in real life, which is really cool. But right now, I'm just going to stick to what we have. I'm actually going to change this to an 85mm lens, which is like a standard film lens. And I'm actually going to back our camera up within the scene. I'm going to give our X value 10, our Y value -10, and then I'm going to go ahead and raise the Z axis up so we're kind of a little bit more zoomed out on our scene. Maybe we could jump this up even a little bit more, -20 and 20, and now we're really zoomed out on our scene, which is great. Again, you can scroll in to expand this view.
So we have our focal length, which we can adjust as we need to. I think 85 is good, so I'm going to go with that. We're going to keep it on our perspective lens. Sensor fit auto, we won't change that. We won't go into safe areas, there's no need to go into that. Background images a little more advanced, we're not going to get into that right now. Viewport display, I do want to show you guys something within this tab. There's this thing called pass part out. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. But if you lower the pass part out, you'll notice the background seems to go outside of the frame more. But if you raise this, you can narrow in on the camera view and not see the outer surroundings of the camera view. And what this can do is allow you to really hone in on your scene and only focus on what is within the camera view. Again, this box is everything that will be rendered. When you go to render your animation or your image, this is what will show. So sometimes I like to turn that value up to something high, maybe like 0.8, just so that I can narrow in on what I'm looking at. It just helps me visually. You might not be the same way, that's totally fine. All right, another quick tip, guys, is you have your composition guides here. So for those of you who know the rule of thirds, you can actually click on rule of thirds and you'll see we have this nice grid overlay. So if you want to lay out your objects to follow the rule of thirds, you can do so. That is totally fine. I'm going to go back to my camera. Make sure you have that selected when you're trying to edit these things or you won't get your options down here. Again, you have different options. I'm not going to go through all the composition guides. I'll keep the rule of thirds on for now. I just wanted to show you guys the options that you have. Depth of field. For those of you who know anything about photography, you know that that involves the focal length. So I'm going to go ahead and check that on. Now, as you can see, everything just went blurry, which is definitely not what we want, right? We want to focus on one of our objects. In order to do that, I'm actually going to click my eyedropper tool and I'm going to select the sphere here. As you can see, our focus has just shifted to the sphere. And what's really great is we can actually adjust our f-stop in the bottom right here. By default, it's 2.8. I'm going to go ahead and turn it down to 0.2 to show you. And as you can see, this sphere right here is way, way more out of focus. And of course, the more that we zoom in on our scene, the stronger the effect should be. So if I go ahead and zoom in and I move my camera up quite a bit, I can do something like 0.01, and now we have an extremely blurred depth of field, which you might like, you might not. I personally think that's way too much, but that's kind of what you get with that effect. So I'm actually going to click off of my focus object. I'm going to cancel this as our focus object, and what I'm going to do is manually adjust the distance. As you can see, I'm increasing it to start to bring everything into focus. And I'm just going to bring our sphere, our top sphere, into focus there. And I'm going to raise our f-stop up just a bit. As you can see, we can create these really nice effects just using depth of field. And it's really incredible the power that you have over the camera. There's a lot that you guys can adjust in here. Feel free to play around with all of these settings. For now, I'm going to turn off depth of field so we can see what's going on. But I just wanted to show you guys how you would go about adjusting your camera settings. Of course, if we go out of our view here, and now we can see our camera in 3D space, you can of course move your camera manually or with your transform tools up here. I'm going to reset it and I'm going to snap back to the camera. So before we get into any shading or anything like that, which guys, you're going to love, it's very, very fun to do, I'm actually just going to try to go through all of these settings right here on the right, because I want to show you guys that this program might look a little overwhelming, but once you understand what everything does, it's going to be a lot easier to understand. So right here in our render properties, this is where you get all your properties for before you're ready to render. As you remember from earlier, we've already went over cycles, GPU, and sort of what supported means here. Let's go over viewport, sampling, and render denoising and all of this stuff right here. So you're probably going to see a lot of this stuff and be like, oh my gosh, what is all this? Guys, don't worry. It's really not too complicated, I promise. When we go to render something, what you want to think about is how detailed it's going to come out. So the higher your sample count is, typically the higher quality your image is going to be and the less noise you're going to have in your image. Now, even if there is noise in your image, we have something called denoising, which basically takes that noise and it calculates how to remove it. And then Blender will actually remove the noise for you, which is a great thing. So For our sample count here, by default, you're going to have 4,096. I'm going to go ahead and enter 300 because for our simple scene right here, you really don't need a lot of samples. You won't have too much noise because there's really not a lot of complexity going on here. So for now, I'm going to keep that at 300. And then as you can see for the viewport, it's set to 1024. You can leave it at that if you want, or you can bump it down to 100 just so you have faster updating times. And basically what this means is that it will only use 100 passes to render the current view. So if I zoom in real quick, you'll see it renders 100 passes and then it slows down. But you can see each time I move, it has to recalculate what that image is going to look like. So you don't have to worry too much about the viewport, but your final render, you definitely want to make sure you have this somewhere that you like it. Denoising, you can leave that unchecked if you want a noisy image, but if you want the image to be denoised, which I highly suggest, you want to click on that, and then you have some options in here. You can use optics or open image denoise. Optics is kind of the standard, so I'm going to use that. Now underneath of here, you'll see that it says advanced. I'm not really going to get into that, but we are going to get into the light paths a little bit. So light paths are very similar to what we have up here. So with our sampling, basically each one of these is a different aspect of how all of the light will be calculated. So right now these are the default values. We can leave these for now, but let's say that you added some volumetrics into your scene. You might want to bump up volume to 3 or 4 because you want to make sure that Blender takes into consideration each of these factors when it's rendering out the scene. So there's a lot of other settings in here, and there's a lot of ways to optimize your scene to get the best results. I'm not going to go too much into this, but this is definitely something to consider looking at. If you have a very glossy material and you want that to really show up in your render, you might want to bump your light paths up just a little bit. But the more light paths that you do have, your total up here, the longer it might take to render. So keep that into consideration. There's another little fancy button down here called Fast GI Approximation, which is just a way for Blender to more quickly interpret what the render is going to look like. You can click that on and you'll see that we get quicker render result. But sometimes you might not want this more harsh shadow. Blender basically will ruin the image sometimes. So be careful with using this. If you don't mind the result, you can keep it on and you'll automatically get a faster render. I personally prefer to keep it off because I think it destroys the image sometimes, so I don't like to take that chance when I go to render. Volumes, we're not using volumetrics right now, so I'm not going to get into that. Curves, I'm sorry guys, I'm not going to go into that. Some of this stuff I really rarely use in my renders. Simplify, I never use that. Motion blur, we can go over that real quick. Basically, motion blur is exactly what you think it is. When an object is moving fast, which I'll get into later when we start keyframing and animating objects, you'll get motion blur. So if you just check that on, automatically Blender is going to calculate what an object would look if it's moving very quickly, and it will actually give it motion blur similar to how your eye would see it in real life or how a camera would see it if you're filming a movie. So guys, I'm just going to check that on because we are going to be doing some animation soon. Film, you don't really have to get too much into this. If you want a transparent background, you can click this and you automatically have a transparent background. We'll get more into that later. It can get really complex with using transparent backgrounds, but basically what that does is it removes the background, the world color that you have set. So I'm going to unclick that. That's very useful, but we're not going to get into that just yet. Performance, I would leave everything default as it is. There are other add-ons to increase your performance when it comes to render times, but you guys can go ahead and try and adjust these things and optimize it yourself. There are add-ons for that I won't go into right now. Bake, not going to get into that. That's a whole nother thing. Grease pencil, not going to get into that. Sorry guys, I got my activate windows down here. Freestyle, I won't get into that. Color management, I will go into a little bit. Down here, this is kind of where you can choose the exposure of your scene, the gamma. If you guys know all these settings, they all have to do with sort of photography and film. For now, I'm just going to keep the view transform on filmic. And then for our look, I'm just going to go to medium high contrast. It's just going to bump the contrast up a little bit. You guys can choose whatever you like. This is kind of where you get a little bit of creative freedom. So that's pretty much everything within the render tab. Like I said, guys, I'm not going to go through every single thing because I genuinely do not use all of these options. You guys are more than welcome to Google any of these if you want to learn more about them. I'm just going through what I use for my workflow so that you guys can understand the very, very core basics. Moving on to our next tab here, we have our output properties. This is incredibly important. I spend a lot of time in here adjusting all of these things. For example, our resolution. As you guys know, if you know anything about graphic design, the resolution is the pixels. So basically right now, we're on full HD, 1920 by 1080. Again, there are presets right here that you can choose from. These little icon right here, you just want to click that and you have 4K, HD, 4:3 for YouTube, all of these things. Honestly, if you do anything less than HD today, it's considered low quality, so I would at least keep it at that, if not 4K. Again, you can adjust this, and as you'll see, it'll adjust in real time for our camera. Let's say I wanted to make something for Instagram. We'll do 1080 by 1080, and if we zoom out, we have square dimensions for our project. So it's very easy to change the project dimensions. I'm going to leave them at default because I think it looks fine. Now, if we go over here to our aspect ratio, I wouldn't mess with that, guys. I would just keep it 1:1. It basically directly affects what's above it right here. Don't worry about render region or crop to render region. Frame rate, do worry about that. 24 is the default. I'm going to go ahead and bump it up to 30 because that's the standard for most social media and other things like that. Now, if you want to slow down your scene later, you can do 60 or 120 frames a second. That's totally up to you. 30 is usually what I keep mine at. Now, frame range. This is where we're going to start to get into the timeline. So I'm actually going to drag our timeline up. Don't be alarmed. There's nothing complicated down here. Basically what this is the frames of our timeline. As you can see, nothing's moving because we haven't animated anything yet. But over here, you'll see that frame 1 is our starting frame, right? And our end frame is 250. Let's say I wanted our animation to only be 3 seconds long. I would type in 90. As you can see, at 30 frames a second, 30 times 3 is 90. So we have a 90-second animation here. And if I go ahead and hit spacebar, it's going to play through our timeline. As you can see, nothing's moving because we haven't animated anything. But this is basically how you adjust the length of our video or the length of the animation. I'm not going to get into time stretching or the steps as of right now. And I'm also not going to get into stereoscopy. That's a whole nother thing. Output. So guys, this is very, very, very important here. This is like one of the core basics, but I'm going to go through it. Basically, this is where you're outputting your renders. So I'm going to click this little folder, and I'm going to select our desktop, and I'm just going to type in test project. You guys can name this whatever you want, and once you have it named how you want, you're just going to click accept, and that is going to be the name of the file that you're exporting. I'm going to leave file extensions turned on, so when it exports, it's going to keep that, .png, .mp4, whatever we decide on. Cache result, I'm going to leave that off. Now, this is where we get into the file format. So when you guys export an animation, frame by frame, it will export an image. That's called an image sequence. Right now, if we were to animate all of this and export it, it would export as a PNG sequence, which is great because we can use this sequence to later composite it within our video compositor. But let's say you don't want to do that. Let's say you want to actually export the whole video so you just get a video file when you go to render. That's totally fine. You can select MPEG video and you can go in here and you can adjust all these settings. Now if you do go ahead and do an MPEG video, I suggest using MPEG 4 and for your codec H.264. You can bump that up to high quality and you can adjust all of your settings as follows. For this tutorial, I want to show you guys the proper way to do it, which I believe is a PNG sequence. So I'm going to keep this on PNG, and I'm actually going to go back to my desktop, and I'm going to make a folder, and I'm going to call it image sequence, or I'm going to spell it wrong, image sequence. I'm going to go into that folder, and now I'm going to click accept. And now when we export all of our images, they're going to export into that folder, and then we can take those and turn them into a video later. The reason that this is a superior way to exporting MP4 is because when you export frame by frame, let's say you get to frame 30 and then Blender craps out and it quits. Well, guess what? You just lost all of that progress if you're exporting an MP4. But if you're exporting a PNG sequence, you can go back to frame 30, reopen up your project, and you can continue to export all of the frames after that. Basically, more or less, you're not losing progress. So PNG is kind of the safe way out of rendering so that you don't mess anything up, guys. I just wanted to tell you that because it has saved me a lot of time on a lot of my client work. So I want you guys to make sure that you don't mess up and you don't waste your time and come back to a render that's failed. So definitely something to think about there. Metadata, not going to go through that. That just has to do with the what the file saves with it. Post-processing, I wouldn't worry about that for now. I really rarely do I touch any of this stuff. The most important thing is the resolution, the frame rate, and then where we're exporting everything. So guys, that was the output properties. Next, I'm going to go over our layer properties. Really, guys, I don't adjust much in here at all. This all has to do with your render and the types of data that you're outputting with your render. I personally barely use any of this. This is like more complex, more advanced stuff that I'm really not going to get into, but it is here for you guys to mess around with. If you're really advanced in Blender, you can go ahead and search online what you can do with all of this stuff. It's way too complex for me to get into at the moment, so I'm going to go forward to our scene properties. Guys, in our scene properties here, this is another area that I rarely mess with. It has to do with the units of measurement within the scene. You guys can adjust this from the metric system to the imperial. Metric, I think, is easier, but you guys can choose whatever you'd like. Gravity has to do with animation, so I'm not going to get into that at the moment. It has to do with physics, so we don't really need to mess with this. Negative 9.8 meters squared. That is the rate at which you would fall to Earth, so that's actually normal gravity. Which makes for a more realistic physics simulation, so just keep that as such. Keying sets, rarely use that. Audio, have never used that. Rigid body world, again, has to do with physics simulation. I'm not going to go into that. Custom properties, rarely do I use that. Guys, I basically never go into this tab. Just keep everything as it is. Let's go ahead and move on to our world tab. This tab I do use a lot. So this is kind of where you can change the background of your scene. Here's your preview up here. It doesn't really show anything right now. I think it's just this gray color. So I'm going to collapse that. This is where you can choose from a background, an environment texture, a sky texture. So I'm just going to go over a few of those. Real quick, I'm going to show you these. Volume, I'm not going to do anything with that. Ray visibility, just keep all of those checked. Settings, just keep all of that as it is. Viewport display, that just means like, are you seeing the same thing as it is up here? Yep, just keep that as follows. And custom properties, again, we're not going to be creating any of those today. Now, what I can show you is that this right here is basically your world color. So let's say we wanted to make a lighter world. That's how you would do that. And you can adjust this to any color that you desire. Now, typically, you wouldn't have a pink world like this. This isn't very realistic. Now, if you're going for this look, that's totally fine. You can leave that to however you want. You can adjust the strength down here. That's totally up to you. I'm going to leave it at 1. But what I want to show you guys is how you can add in your own sky texture. So if you just click this little dot right here, you'll notice we have a bunch of different options. Environment texture is one that I choose a lot, but one that's built into Blender is actually called sky texture. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and I'm going to adjust it to Prethum. And then if I just scroll around the scene, you'll notice we have this awesome little sky texture in here. And this is just a really quick way to get some interesting lighting into your scene. And you can choose from different presets such as Hosek Wilkie, which is more of like a night scene. And then of course Nishita, which is more of a, I guess, a sunset kind of scene. I personally like Prethum, so I'm going to keep it on that. I'm going to snap back to my camera view. Now, if you click back on this dot again, you can choose environment texture, and I just want to quickly show you what that can offer you. If you click on environment texture, you'll notice everything turns pink, and that's because we don't have a file selected yet. But if we go and we open a file, I can go ahead to my HDRI folder, which I'll get into later what these are. Basically, they're just a 3D photo of a world. So I'm going to click on this one, and it's going to load it up into our scene. And as you can see, we have this 3D environment now changing the lighting of our scene. And what's great about this is it's actually generating the lighting for everything. So if we wanted to, we could just hide this light from the viewport and render, and now we have our lighting directly from our HDRI. So that's a very, very awesome way to just quickly get lighting into your scene. I just wanted to show you guys that because it's super useful for getting your lighting. And then you don't have to use your manual lights anymore. You can just use the HDRI. So guys, that's how you would change HDRI or your world color. So now that we have an HDRI, let's go ahead and move on to some of these other sections here. Our next section here is called Shape Collection. I'm not going to get into this because to be honest, I really don't know what it does and I rarely use it. Now our next section here is called the object properties. So in sometimes I forget what these are actually called. Object properties, we have the same metrics that we have up here for our transform. So if you select an object, it'll tell you where it is in space, how it's rotated. I'm going to go ahead and collapse that. Relations, we're not going to get into that just yet, but it has to do with how objects are related to each other, if there's animation data copied from one to the other, which we won't get into just yet. Collections just has to do with, I believe, your collections up here. Again, not getting into that. Instancing is a whole nother thing. A lot of people have covered this on YouTube. There's some great tutorials on it. I'm not going to be covering that. Motion paths, also not going to be covering that. Again, I rarely use this tab. Motion blur. So if you have your object selected, you can turn off motion blur for that specific object. Pretty useful if you want it to seem stationary for whatever reason. Shading, we're going to get into that a little bit later. Shading, there's a lot to it, so I'm not going to get into it right now. Visibility. So visibility is actually pretty important. Basically, if you click viewport here, that's another way to basically click this eye on and off. So you're going to not show in the viewport, or let's say you do want it to show in the viewport, but not in the render. You can click that here or up in your hierarchy. So either way, you can decide if you want it to show up in your render or your viewport here or in the hierarchy. It doesn't really matter. And of course, we're going to talk about these little dots later. That just means you can keyframe that. So we're going to get into that stuff later. Right here, you can decide if you want the camera to be able to see the object, if you want the glossiness to appear, the diffusion to appear, transmission, volume, scatter. Shadow is pretty interesting because you can have it cast a shadow or not cast a shadow. So there's a lot of settings within that. Viewport display, this is just some settings for your viewport, nothing too crazy there. Line art, not going to get into that. Custom properties, I almost never create them, so we're not going to do those either. Now our next tab is the Modifiers tab. This tab is pretty awesome. Basically, you can see there's not much here, and that's because we haven't added any modifiers. You can think of a modifier as a way to directly affect an object that is editable. So you can basically turn the modifier on or off. So I'm just going to add a array modifier to this. And as you can see, what that does is it basically just duplicates the object. Now you can go in here and you can adjust all of these settings. You can have it duplicate the object 4 times, 5 times, however many times that you want. And then what's great about this is you can actually turn this off for the viewport or the render. So similar to our hierarchy up here, you can hide or show this effect in either the viewport or your final render. Now, we haven't gone to render anything yet, but you'll understand once we do click render what that does and how that affects everything within our scene. I'm going to go ahead and click X to get rid of this modifier. There's a lot of modifiers to go over in here. I'll try to link the video that I watched that goes over every single one. But basically what this does is it allows you to mess around with your object and add a bunch of modifiers if you need to. There's a lot you can do within here. This is basically just like effects for your object. This is kind of one way you can think about it. For example, wireframe. If you go ahead and zoom in on our object here, you'll notice that it takes all the vertexes and the points and it basically just creates this wireframe effect. And you can adjust it right here, which is really cool. So guys, that is just a quick way to show you how to add modifiers. I'm not going to go through every single one. There's just way too many. But I do use this tab a lot just to create some quick effects on my object or animate them in a certain way. Now our next tab here is a particle tab. I'm not really going to get into that too much. There's plenty of tutorials on that, but that would be like creating sparks or creating debris falling from the sky, that's kind of where you would get into that stuff right there. That's really complex, so I'm not going to get into it for this basic tutorial. The next one is going to be our physics tab. So this is all the physics properties of our objects. I will get into this a little bit later, and we're going to create some basic physics simulations, nothing too crazy. But for now, I'm going to skip over that until we come back to it later. The next one down is object constraints. I don't use these often, but they are useful. Basically, it allows you to add constraints to your objects so that you can lock them in place, have them not pivot past a certain point, etc. You can have your camera track certain things. This, again, I don't use this a lot. There are plenty of tutorials on this. This can get super complex, super fast. But basically what it allows you to do is a lot of creative things with limiting your distance, your location, your rotation, scale. So definitely something to play around with, but I wouldn't, if you're a beginner, I would just not mess with this for now until you're really ready and you have a full grasp of Blender and kind of what it's capable of. Our next tab here is our object data properties. Again, kind of something I don't go into too much. One thing I will go into within here is our normals, and I will auto smooth, which just basically kind of creates this auto smoothing effect for our object. I'm not going to get into that too much. That's kind of like an editing thing as well. So guys, there's a lot in here. Don't be overwhelmed. A lot of this you won't end up using until you're really getting into the depths of Blender, which again, I'm only teaching the basics, guys. I'm not going to go into the really, really complex stuff. So that's pretty much everything for the object data properties. And then next we have our materials tab. This is where we're going to get into the fun stuff, guys. This is where we're going to start creating our own materials, and I'm just going to show you guys how to create a basic shader. So what I'm going to do is go back to my modifiers tab, and I'm just going to click X to get rid of this modifier. And I'm going to go ahead and delete this, and I'm going to move our sphere to the middle here, so it's like right above our cube, just like that. So now that we have that right there, I'm going to go to my materials tab, and as you can see, there's not much here. That's because we haven't created any materials yet. So I'm going to create a new material for this object, and now we can choose the color, and we can adjust a ton of different settings. So I'm just going to choose this nice blue color here, and as you can see, you already have your first shader. Now you can adjust all of these attributes here. I'm just going to raise the metallic up, and I'm going to lower the roughness. As you can see, we're creating this nice metallic shader right out of thin air. Not much work at all. And that's basically it, guys. That's how you would create a material. Let's say you didn't really like this material. You click this little X and it'll get rid of it. Now I'm going to Control Z to undo that because I actually really liked that material. Oops. I'm going to go back to that material, and I'm actually going to lower the roughness back down a lot so it's almost like a mirror-like effect. And as you can see, it's reflecting our environment, and it's super cool. Now really quick, I want to show you guys how to easily copy a material to another object. You click on the object that you want to apply the material to, shift click the object you're trying to copy from, and then you're going to do Control L, and now you can link pretty much anything. So I'm going to link the materials, and now our material is applied to our bottom object as well. You'll notice it's not too reflective until you get to a certain angle, so don't be alarmed if it doesn't look exactly the same. Every object reflects light in a different way, so keep that in mind when you're messing around with things in Blender. So let's go ahead and snap to our camera view. As you can see, there's our objects. I'm just going to select both of them and move them to the center of the frame, scale them down quite a bit. That looks pretty cool right there. So as you can see, we've already created this cool little project just like that. Maybe we can add some depth of field with what we learned earlier. Let me go into my camera settings, add some depth of field, and let's go ahead and give that a f-stop of 1. And just like that, we have a nice blurred background, and we're focused on our objects here. That looks really, really nice. So guys, those are pretty much more or less the basics. There's only one more tab I didn't go through yet, and that has to do with one of the modifiers, and that is our texture properties down here. So I'm just going to show you real quick what that does. So if I go into my modifiers tab, let me save this project real quick, and I add a displacement modifier. Let's say I want to create a new displacement. I'm going to click on new, And then down here, I want to select texture properties, and basically this has to do with the modifier I just applied. So if I go here and I click clouds, you'll notice not really much happens, and that's because there's not a lot of geometry here. But if I do the same thing to this and I apply a displacement and I click new and I go into my texture properties and click clouds, now you'll notice we have this really cool effect with one of our modifiers there. So you can go into our modifiers and you can adjust as follows. You can make it stronger, you can change the mid-level. There's a lot of cool things you can do, but basically down here is where you kind of customize these things to your liking. So super cool, just a quick way to add fun effects to your objects. So I hope you guys enjoyed this part of it. Next, I'm just going to go into a little bit of editing. So we're going to play around with edit mode, get into that, and then that'll pretty much wrap up the basics of everything, and then we can start rendering some stuff out, animating, and doing some physics tests. So guys, in order to show you our editing, I'm going to go back to solid view. I'm going to click on our cube here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to press tab, and tab is going to bring us into edit mode. I'm going to press tab again to get out of it, and then up here in the left corner you'll see it says object mode. Another way to get to edit mode is to have this drop down come down, and then you just click on edit mode. And now we're in edit mode, and what we're able to do is just like before where we move and rotate things, we can select any point, we can move it, we can scale it up. Well, you can't scale it up because it's only one point, but if we had two of them, you could scale it up or scale it in. And this is how you edit objects. So in this mode, there is a lot you can do. I'm just going to go over some of the basics, such as extruding and scaling things down and creating edge loops. So right here, we have these three little icons. This one is select mode. So the select mode is vertex. So right now we can select any of these vertexes and move them as we desire. Or we can select an edge, and we can move the edge as desired. And there's one more select mode, and that is face select. Again, you guessed it, we can move the face however we want. So this is kind of the basics of editing. Now let's say I wanted to take this face and extrude it. E is to extrude. So what E does is it basically takes something, extrudes it from that point, and allows you to basically expand it out as if it's growing. So definitely a super useful thing right there. Again, we have all of our transform tools like before, so if we just wanted to scale this whole face, we could, just like that. Again, if we want to go to our side view, it'll be easier to see what we're doing. And this is a really interesting way to edit things. So we can press E to extrude, and let's say we want this to come back out like the other end. We would just scale it up, just like that. Or we could extrude it one more time, and then we could scale that up. Now it's not perfect, but you get the idea. These are the basics of editing. You can extrude things very easily with E, and you can scale things down. You can move them, and you can even rotate them if you like. So guys, these are the basics of editing. You have faces, edges, and vertices. So these are what make up a 3D model. Now let's tab out of edit mode, and now we have our newly created object here. Let's say we wanted to make it a little smoother, make all those edges just a little bit smoother. We could go in here, get our displacement modifier out of here, and we could go ahead and create a bevel modifier, right? And so it's starting to bevel all those edges, and we would just increase our segments maybe up to 10. And then I'm going to right click and shade smooth. Now we have this nice smooth look to our object. So that's just a quick way to get a quick effect with something you just created. I'm going to turn that off because I don't really like the way that looks, and I'm going to shade this flat again. So guys, that's just like the basics of editing. I'm not going to go too much into it. There's plenty of tutorials on how to really get into this stuff. Again, something that I don't want to do at the moment just because there's just so much to cover. Again, you can snap things to a certain axis. So if I wanted to extrude this just along the Y, E, Y, And then let's say I wanted to rotate this before I extrude it again. So I rotate that, right? And I'm going to extrude this up like such. And then I'm going to go ahead and rotate that, extrude it again. And this is just a really quick way to create things. Remember guys, E is to extrude, right? G is to move, and S is to scale. Okay? Of course, you can also delete and dissolve vertices, but this is just a really, really fun way to kind of mess around with your objects and quickly create things from scratch and learn some basic modeling. So guys, that's pretty much how you do some basic modeling there. Let's go ahead and get into some basic keyframing, and then we'll get into some physics. So guys, in order to make this a little simpler, I'm actually just going to delete what we just made. Okay? You can also hide it if you want, so I'll hide that. And I'm going to add in a cube. So we have a cube in our scene here. Now what I want to do is snap to my camera view, make sure we can see our cube. Yep, looks like it's visible. Maybe bring it up just a little bit over here. Now what I want to do is I want to animate this cube real quick and just make it go from one side to the other. All I'm going to do with my cube selected, you see I can have my timeline down here, right? You should have this in your layout view, which is what we're in right now. I is going to be insert. And so what that's going to do is allow us to insert what's called a keyframe. And what a keyframe is basically data on this object that says, hey, this object's right here. It's rotated this way, it's placed this way, it's scaled this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keyframe the location and the rotation. So Blender is going to go ahead and say, okay, this object is rotated this way and it's located right here. So I'm going to click that. And as soon as I click that, you'll notice there's this little dot on the timeline down here. And what that is that recorded data for that specific location and rotation. Now I'm going to go forward to frame 30 and I'm just going to move my object somewhere else, okay? And I'm going to rotate it another way like that. Now what I'm going to do is press I again and insert location and rotation again. Now what that's going to do is record our new location. So if we go back to frame 1, if we scrub through our timeline, we'll notice the object moves from one side to the other. And it also rotates because we changed our rotational value and our location value. Now if we play this back, you can see the object slides from one side to the other. And that is basically how you animate something. Very, very simple. So I won't go too much into how that works, but what I will show you is if you highlight your keyframes down here in the timeline and you right click, you can actually adjust the interpolation mode. And what that means is how it calculates the animation. So basically right now it should be set to linear by default, which means it just goes from one side to the other over a linear time period. Bezier is a little bit more of a smooth animation. And then one of my favorites is back. I'm going to show you what this does. I'm going to click back and then I'm going to play my animation. As you can see, it goes forward and it almost goes past the point that we selected and it kind of springs back a little bit. So that's kind of a fun little way to just tweak your animations. Another way you can change it is you can click on exponential. I'm going to show you what that looks like. Exponential starts very slow and then it speeds up towards the end. So you guys can experiment with all these different interpolation modes and it's really just fun to play around with. Now let's say we wanted our cube to go to this side and then come right back afterwards. How would we do that? Well, I guess we would go to frame 60 and then we would move it over here again. You could do that, right? Or you could select your first keyframe, which has our original location data, Shift D to duplicate, and then I'm just going to drag it all the way to frame 60. And what I just did there is I now allowed us to animate the cube back into its original spot. So just like that, we have our cube animating from left to right and then back from right to left because we've copied that original location and moved it to frame 60. So I hope you guys are following. Again, this is pretty simple stuff, but that's how you would animate something. And if you wanted it to move back to the other side again, you would simply duplicate frame 30, that keyframe, and you could move it to frame 70 or so. So now if we play back our whole animation, it'll look like that. Right? And if you want to delete a keyframe and you decide you don't want it there anymore, X is the same way that you would delete an object. You also delete keyframes that same way. So guys, that is pretty much how you animate something. Pretty simple. Go ahead and try it for yourself and let me know what you come up with. You can do this with any object. You can do it with any value. As you can see, if I go to frame 15, you have all of these options here. You have location, rotation, scale, all three of those. There's even other things that I won't go into, but there's so much that you can do with just these basics right here. Now we're going to go into one more thing. We're going to just make a quick physics simulation. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this cube, and I'm going to add in a plane. Okay, I'm going to scale this plane up a bunch, just like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Object up here, Apply, Scale. And what that's going to do is just make sure that our object is what we say it is. Like, this is now the 1-to-1 scale of this object. Now I'm going to go into my physics properties over here, and I'm going to add in a rigid body physics property. Now for our type, we want to choose passive. And that basically means that this is just a floor. It won't move, but things can still bounce off of it and fall onto it. And then for our shape, I'm going to choose mesh. Okay? And that should be all we need to do for that. And now I'm going to go back to frame 1. I'm going to add in a cube, and I'm going to move it above our scene, G, Z to move, right? I'm just going to give it a little bit of rotation, and I'm going to go ahead and add a rigid body to this. And for our shape, I'm going to use mesh, and we're going to make that active. And now, if we press play, you can see we have a little physics simulation, right? As you can see, it gets cut off at frame 90 because that's how long our timeline is. But now you can go in here and you can adjust the mass. We're going to make it a little heavier, and you'll see how that affects everything. Very awesome. There's a ton of little settings in here that you can adjust. Bounciness, friction. I'm going to turn the friction up and we'll see what we get there. There's just so many things that you guys can play around with here. It's going to be a lot of fun. Again, our plane also has bounciness and friction. I'm going to turn the friction up on our plane to see how that affects our physics simulation. As you can see, we're still getting this crazy bounciness. I do want to change our original rotation to see if we can get this thing to sit flat. Let's go ahead and play that now. You can see it's a little bit better, but still very, very bouncy. So there's a lot, guys, like I said, there's a lot of things that you can adjust in here. But I just wanted to show you guys how to create a basic physics simulation. There are so many things to choose from in here. I'm not going to go through them all, but that would be how you make an object fall. So let's say we had another cube. I'm just going to duplicate this. And what's great is it's also going to duplicate the physics properties for this as well. Just make sure they're not touching. Let's go ahead and press play. And as you can see, they bounce right off of each other. Pretty fun stuff. So that's how you create a very, very basic physics simulation. So guys, now let's go ahead and render something real quick. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to snap to my camera view, go back to our rendered view, right? And I'm just going to apply a few quick shaders to these. I'm going to give this a darker black shader, and I'm going to give these a blue shader with metallic up high, roughness low, and I'm going to duplicate the material here. So now if we play this back, you can see we just have our objects falling, and then they stop at the end there. Nothing too crazy. I'm actually going to scale our plane up, and I'm going to zoom our camera out quite a bit, just like that. That looks pretty good. Maybe we'll even adjust our camera angle as well. And scale this up even more. Object, apply, scale. Let's go ahead and play this back. That looks pretty good. So now guys, what I want to do is just show you how we can go ahead and render this out. So I'm going to save our project. I'm going to go and check our output properties. It looks like we still have our folder selected for our image sequence. We are on PNG, which is exactly what we want. And then for the purposes of this tutorial, for our max samples, I'm going to choose 25. Now what I want to show you guys is how you can do a quick test render. So I'm going to do render image up here, and it's just going to render one image for us. Let's see how long it takes. It took about 2 seconds and 2.83 seconds, so not too bad. So there is our image render right there. Now what we want to do is we actually just want to go to our solid view so we don't have to process anything here. And then I'm going to click render animation. And then what it's going to do is it's going to go through each frame. So as you can see on the timeline here, it's going through each frame and rendering all of those out. So I'm going to go ahead and come back when this is done, and I'm going to show you guys how to composite all of these frames into an animation within Blender. So I'll be right back once this is done. Alright guys, so everything is all done. As you can see, it says frame 90 here, and it'll tell you right here how long everything took to render by frame. So right here it'll tell you it took about 2.36 seconds for that final frame to render. So I'm going to go ahead and X out of this. What I'm going to do is File, New, Video Editing. Make sure you have that other project saved. So now all you have to do to compile all of our frames is you want to go and click Add, Image Sequence, and then I'm going to find my folder, Image Sequence, and as you can see, these are all of our frames here. What we want to do is click our first frame right here, scroll all the way down, holding Shift, you want to click on the final one to select everything, and you're going to click Add Image Strip. And what that's going to do is that's going to add our image strip right in here, and then we want to select our frame amount, which was 90. We want to select our frame rate, which is 30 frames a second, and then the resolution looks good. That can stay the same. I'm going to zoom out here a bit so we can see. Now down here there's going to be a little tab called Video. You want to click on that. You want to click Reverse Frames, okay? So that's going to, sometimes your stuff will get imported in reverse, so if that happens, click on Reverse Frames. Go into Transform, make sure the scale of X and Y are at 1, and then you should be able to play your video now, and then we can export it. As you can see, that is the video we just created. So everything is set up properly. Now what we want to do is we want to select an output. I'm going to select my desktop, and I'm going to call this Final Video. Oops, Final Video, just like that. And then I'm going to click Accept. And now you're going to go up to the top, render animation, and it's going to compile all of our frames together, right? All right, it just finished. Now I'm going to minimize this, and here's our final video right here. As you can see, that is how you compile your PNG sequence into a video. So just like that, we've created our video. It looks really good. I'm going to play it one more time. You've got some motion blur in there, you've got some materials, and some physics. Again, you can do this with your keyframed animation, but this is just what I wanted to show you guys for the purposes of this tutorial. So that's pretty much all of the basics that I wanted to teach you guys. If there's anything else you want to learn, of course I can teach it. I'll continue to put out tutorials no matter what, but I just wanted to teach you the bare minimum of what I thought you needed to know just to start creating your own projects. There is obviously so much more to Blender than just this. But I just wanted to take some quick time this morning to just go through what I think are the basics. And yeah, guys, go ahead and select New General Project and go ahead and get in there and start messing around. And let me know what you guys come up with. I'm super excited to see what you can create just based on what I showed you today. Again, this was the very bare minimum basics, but I just wanted to go through kind of my workflow, what I do, how you move stuff around, how you add scene lighting, materials. Guys, go ahead and drop a comment below. Let me know what you thought. I hope you enjoyed this teaching style. I hope that this helps you. And if there's anything else you want to learn, drop a comment down below. I'll be sure to try to cover it in a later tutorial. Until then, guys, take it easy. I will see you in the next tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you learned something. Please like this video and subscribe. I'm going to put more content out in the future for you guys, so take it easy, take care, good luck, and go get your blend on. Don't delete the default cube. I'll see you guys later. Take it easy.